The night was quiet, the kind of silence that only a small town like Pine Hollow could offer. The hum of distant traffic was a mere whisper, overshadowed by the steady ticking of the old clock in Alex Bennett's attic. This attic, cluttered with dusty equipment and half-forgotten relics from another era, was where Alex found solace. Here, among the static and the whir of machines, he felt a connection to a world that had long since moved on without him. Alex wasn't just any radio enthusiast. He was a relic himself, a man who had once thrived on uncovering secrets as a journalist, but now spent his days chasing echoes on the airwaves. The walls of his attic were adorned with maps, radio schematics, and news clippings, each telling a story of his past obsessions. But tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an almost imperceptible shift that he couldn't quite place. He adjusted the knobs on his radio, the familiar crackle of static filling the room as he scanned the frequencies. It was a ritual he had performed countless times before, driven by an insatiable curiosity and a desire to find something, anything, that could rekindle the spark of his former life. He had heard it all: pirate radio stations, military communications, even the occasional encrypted message. But tonight, as he dialed through the frequencies, he stumbled upon something he had never encountered before. It started faintly, almost a whisper beneath the static, but there was no mistaking it. A series of numbers repeated over and over in a cold, detached voice. 4, 7, 3, 9, 1, 2. The sequence was relentless, each number delivered with a mechanical precision that sent a shiver down Alex's spine. It wasn't just the numbers, though. There were other sounds too, strange and unsettling. A metallic scraping like nails on a chalkboard, followed by what sounded like a distant scream, almost human but not quite. Alex leaned closer to the speaker, his breath hitching as the numbers continued. He grabbed a pen and a notepad, hastily scribbling down the sequence. 4, 7, 3, 9, 1, 2. The numbers repeated themselves without variation, like a mantra or a code. He had heard of number stations before, mysterious broadcasts believed to be used for espionage during the Cold War. But this felt different, more immediate, more personal. He played the recording back, listening intently. The voice was monotone, devoid of any emotion, but the sounds that accompanied it were disturbingly organic. The more he listened, the more uneasy he became. The scraping noise was rhythmic, almost as if it was trying to convey something beneath the surface of the broadcast. And that scream, it was too faint to identify clearly, but it lodged itself in Alex's mind like a splinter. He spent the next few hours cross-referencing the numbers with anything he could think of: dates, coordinates, military codes, trying to find a pattern. But nothing fit. Frustrated, he pushed the notepad aside and ran a hand through his thinning hair. It was just a fluke, he told himself. Just another strange frequency with no real meaning. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew he was lying. This was different, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to hear. In the days that followed, Alex became consumed by the broadcast. He recorded every instance of it, comparing the sequences, searching for a clue. Each time, the numbers were the same, unchanging, as if they were mocking his efforts to understand them. The sounds, too, remained constant, yet they gnawed at him with a growing sense of dread. It was on the 5th day that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. While reading the morning paper, a headline caught his eye. "Train derailment claims 12 lives." The accident had occurred the previous night at 11:47 p.m. A chill ran down his spine as he looked at the numbers he had jotted down just hours before. 4, 7, 3, 9, 1, 2. Could it be a coincidence? He quickly dismissed the thought, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Alex's obsession deepened as he started to look for correlations between the broadcasts and real-world events. He scoured the news for anything that could match the numbers. The more he searched, the more he found accidents, disasters, all seemingly predicted by the broadcast, sometimes just minutes before they occurred. It wasn't long before he realized that the frequency was no ordinary number station. It was something far more sinister. He tried to dismiss his growing paranoia as sleep deprivation and overwork, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. The numbers were a code, but not in the traditional sense. They were a prediction, a harbinger of death and destruction, and Alex was the only one who knew. He considered reaching out to his old contacts in the journalism world, but how could he explain this? He had no proof, just a gut feeling and a series of coincidences that no one else would believe. The more he listened, the more the broadcasts seemed to target him directly. The numbers were becoming more frequent, the accompanying sounds more disturbing. Every time he tried to walk away, the frequency would draw him back, as if it had a life of its own. He began to fear the nights, knowing that each one would bring another broadcast, another set of numbers that would gnaw away at his sanity. The days after Alex Bennett's discovery of the strange broadcast blurred into one long, sleepless vigil. He found himself caught in a cycle of anticipation and dread, waiting for the next sequence of numbers, the next eerie transmission that would push him deeper into the abyss. What had begun as a curious anomaly was now a terrifying obsession. Each night, Alex would sit in his attic, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered room. The radio was always on, tuned to that same unlisted frequency. The static filled the air like a living entity, crackling with anticipation. And then it would begin. The cold, mechanical voice reciting numbers, the scraping sound that had become all too familiar, and sometimes the faintest hint of a scream that set his nerves on edge. At first, the numbers had seemed random, a riddle to be solved. But as Alex delved deeper, he began to notice a pattern that chilled him to the bone. The broadcasts were no longer just abstract sequences. They were targeting him, reflecting events from his own life in a way that was impossible to dismiss. It started subtly. Alex noticed the numbers often correlated with small incidents, a minor car accident he witnessed, a sudden blackout in his neighborhood. These events seemed insignificant at first, but the timing was too precise to ignore. The numbers predicted them with unnerving accuracy, down to the minute. Each time something happened, Alex would check his notes, his hands trembling, only to find that the broadcast had foretold it. The broadcasts grew more frequent, more personal. One evening, as Alex was preparing to leave his attic and try to get some sleep, the voice on the radio changed. It was still the same monotone, but there was something different in its cadence, something almost familiar. The numbers it recited felt different too, like they were aimed directly at him. 4, 3, 1, 2, 9, 5. Alex froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He couldn't explain it, but he knew with a certainty that defied logic that this sequence was meant for him. It wasn't just a prediction, it was a warning. He tried to shake off the feeling, to rationalize it away, but the pit in his stomach only deepened. The next day, as he was driving through town, Alex saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A car, a red sedan, sped through a red light at the intersection just as he was about to cross. The near miss left him shaken, but what truly terrified him was what he saw on the license plate. The numbers 4, 3, 1, 2, 9, and 5. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be a coincidence. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The broadcasts weren't just predicting general events. They were zeroing in on him, following his every move, anticipating his every step. Alex's paranoia grew with each passing day. The broadcasts started to include details that were impossible for anyone else to know. References to his daily routines, places he frequented, even the time he left his house in the morning. The sounds that accompanied the numbers became more disturbing, more invasive. He could no longer dismiss them as mere background noise. They were signals, messages meant to unsettle him, to break down his defenses. One particularly harrowing night, the broadcast mentioned a location by name, a cafe where Alex often stopped for coffee. The numbers were precise, corresponding to the coordinates of the cafe, followed by a time that sent chills down his spine. 10:32 a.m. The message was clear. Something was going to happen there, and it was going to happen soon. Desperate for answers, Alex decided to test the broadcast. The next morning, he deliberately avoided the cafe, choosing a different route entirely. But the anxiety gnawed at him all day. He couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything other than the numbers and what they might mean. By the time 10:32 a.m. came and went, he was a wreck, his mind racing with possibilities. Later that afternoon, Alex couldn't resist the urge to check the cafe. When he arrived, he was greeted by a sight that made his blood run cold. A car, the same red sedan from before, had crashed into the front of the building, shattering the windows. It had happened at exactly 10:32 a.m. Alex's knees buckled, and he had to grip the door frame to steady himself. The broadcast had been right again, but this time he had tried to change the outcome. It hadn't mattered. The event had still occurred, as if the broadcast was determined to fulfill its prophecy, no matter what Alex did. As the days wore on, the broadcasts became even more invasive, referencing people in Alex's life with increasing specificity. One night, the voice on the radio mentioned his sister, Emma, who lived in another state. The numbers were followed by the sound of labored breathing, then silence. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he dialed her number, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the buttons. When Emma answered, she sounded tired, but otherwise fine. Alex tried to warn her, tried to explain what he had been experiencing, but she dismissed his concerns as the ramblings of an overworked mind. "You're scaring yourself, Alex," she said gently. "You need to get some sleep." But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The broadcast had mentioned her for a reason. And then, just days later, Emma fell seriously ill, her condition deteriorating rapidly. The doctors were baffled by the sudden onset of symptoms, unable to diagnose what was wrong. As Alex sat by her hospital bed, guilt and fear gnawed at him. The broadcast had warned him, but he had been powerless to stop it. The sequence of numbers that night was one Alex would never forget. It was the same as before, the same pattern that had haunted him since the beginning, but now it was infused with a sense of finality. The scraping noise was louder, more insistent, and the scream that followed was unmistakable. A cry of despair that mirrored Alex's own growing sense of hopelessness. He couldn't deny it any longer. The broadcasts were no longer just a passive prediction of events. They were actively shaping his reality, influencing the world around him in ways he couldn't comprehend. Every attempt he made to change the outcome only seemed to reinforce the broadcast's accuracy, as if it was playing a game with him, toying with his life like a cat with a mouse. Alex's isolation deepened as he withdrew from everyone around him. He stopped going out, stopped answering calls, stopped trying to explain what was happening. The only thing that mattered was the radio, the relentless voice that now seemed to be the only thing that understood him, even as it drove him closer to the brink. And then, one night, the broadcast delivered a message that left Alex paralyzed with fear. The numbers were the same, but the sequence ended with a date and a time. The voice spoke it clearly, as if it were reciting a simple fact. August 23rd, 11:58 p.m. It was the date of his own death. The message was undeniable, the certainty of it sinking into Alex's bones. He tried to resist, tried to think of any way to avoid the inevitable, but deep down he knew the truth. The broadcast had never been wrong. It was a harbinger, a force that could not be denied, and now it had set its sights on him. As the days ticked down to the predicted date, Alex found himself drawn into a twisted dance with fate. Every attempt he made to escape the broadcast's prophecy seemed futile, as if the very act of trying to avoid his fate only brought him closer to it. He became a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in a cycle of fear and resignation, knowing that no matter what he did, the numbers would always win. The night of August 23rd arrived like a shadow, creeping slowly but inexorably across the town of Pine Hollow. The air was thick with the weight of something inevitable, something that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even years. In the quiet of his attic, Alex Bennett sat alone, the walls around him seeming to close in as the seconds ticked down toward midnight. He had tried to prepare himself, to resist the pull of the broadcast, but deep down he had always known that this moment would come. The numbers had been clear, precise, unyielding in their prediction. They had dictated his every move, led him down a path from which there was no escape. And now, at the final hour, Alex felt a cold acceptance settle over him, as if his fate had been sealed the moment he first tuned into that fateful frequency. The radio was silent. The static that had once filled the room, once consumed his life, was gone, leaving only an eerie stillness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The attic, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The charts and maps that lined the walls, the equipment that had been his constant companions, now seemed like relics of a life that no longer belonged to him. 11:50 p.m. The clock on the wall ticked with a relentless precision, each second a countdown to the moment the numbers had foretold. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm of his pulse matching the steady tick of the clock. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee the house, to do anything but stay here, waiting for the end. But he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a force he couldn't explain, couldn't resist. He had tried everything, destroying the radio, ignoring the broadcasts, even leaving town for a few days in a futile attempt to escape the numbers' grasp. But it had all been for nothing. The numbers had followed him, haunted him, drawn him back to this place, this moment. And now, as the final minutes slipped away, Alex realized that it had never been about escaping. It had always been about understanding. 11:55 p.m. Alex stood, his legs trembling beneath him, and walked to the window. Outside, the world seemed impossibly calm, the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, the town below bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, a cruel contrast to the storm raging inside him. He placed his hands on the windowsill, the cool glass a welcome relief against his burning skin. But even as he looked out at the peaceful night, his mind was consumed by the numbers, their relentless march toward the inevitable. August 23rd, 11:58 p.m. The time was etched into his brain, an indelible mark that had defined his every action, every thought, for weeks. He had tried to resist it, to deny the power the numbers held over him, but it was no use. They were inescapable, immutable, as constant as the ticking of the clock. The realization brought with it a strange sense of calm, as if by accepting his fate, he had freed himself from the torment that had plagued him for so long. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the final minute approached. The air around him seemed to hum with anticipation, the very walls of the attic vibrating with the tension that threatened to snap at any moment. The radio, though silent, seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if waiting for the right moment to come to life once more. And then, at 11:57 p.m., the radio crackled to life, the familiar voice reciting one final sequence of numbers, followed by a sound that sent a wave of cold terror through Alex's veins, the sound of his own name, spoken in that same emotionless tone. Alex Bennett, 11:58 p.m. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the final moments of his life ticked away. The world seemed to close in around him, the walls of the attic pressing down, suffocating him with the weight of the inevitable. And then, as the clock struck 11:58, the radio fell silent, the voice gone, leaving only the sound of static in its wake. But Alex knew deep down that it wasn't over. The broadcast had done its job, and now all that was left was for the prediction to be fulfilled. As the final seconds slipped away, Alex closed his eyes and waited, the sound of static filling his ears, drowning out everything else until there was nothing left but silence. Alex Bennett's world had shrunk to the size of his attic. Once a place of solace and curiosity, it had become a prison, the walls closing in on him with each passing day. The clutter of old radios, dusty maps, and tangled wires that once held the charm of a life well lived now suffocated him. Every object in the room seemed to carry the weight of his growing dread, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and unwashed clothes. Days and nights bled into one another as Alex lost track of time, the steady ticking of the clock on the wall his only anchor to reality. But even that anchor was slipping, the hands moving in a way that felt foreign, as if time itself was conspiring against him. He hadn't left the house in days, maybe weeks. The outside world was no longer a place of refuge. It was a stage where the horrors predicted by the broadcasts played out with chilling accuracy. He hadn't always been this way. Alex had been a man of reason, a journalist who prided himself on uncovering the truth, no matter how dark or hidden. But now, the truth was a curse, one he couldn't escape. The broadcasts had become his reality, their cold, mechanical voice, the only thing that made sense in a world turned upside down. The numbers had taken on a life of their own, a life that seemed hell-bent on destroying his. It wasn't just the predictions anymore. The broadcasts had wormed their way into his mind, their influence growing stronger with each passing day. The numbers weren't just predictions, they were commands, instructions that Alex felt compelled to follow, even as he resisted with every ounce of his being. It was as if the broadcasts had become a part of him, a malignant force that whispered in his ear, guiding his every move. The first sign of his unraveling had been subtle, a creeping sense of unease that grew with each broadcast. But now that unease had blossomed into full-blown paranoia. Alex saw patterns in everything, numbers on license plates, the arrangement of books on his shelf, the way the shadows fell across the floor. Nothing was random. Everything was connected, part of a grand design that only he could see. His once orderly attic was now a chaotic mess, the walls covered in hastily scrawled notes and equations that made sense only to him. Strings of red yarn crisscrossed the room, connecting seemingly disparate events in a web of conspiracy that he was certain held the key to understanding the broadcasts. But the more he tried to decipher the code, the deeper he fell into the labyrinth of his own mind. Sleep was a distant memory, the few hours he managed to steal plagued by nightmares that left him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. In his dreams, the numbers chased him through dark, endless corridors, their cold voice echoing off the walls. He would wake with the numbers still ringing in his ears, the same sequence repeating over and over like a broken record. His appearance deteriorated along with his sanity. He no longer cared about shaving or showering, his clothes stained and rumpled, his hair a tangled mess. The man who stared back at him from the mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with a wildness that frightened even him. He could see the madness in his own eyes, a reflection of the terror that consumed him. The broadcasts grew more frequent, more intense. The numbers now came at all hours, sometimes in the dead of night, waking him from a fitful sleep with their relentless, droning cadence. Alex would leap from his bed, his heart pounding, and rush to his radio, desperate to hear the message, to understand what the numbers were telling him. But the more he listened, the less he understood. The numbers were the same, always the same, yet they held a power over him that he couldn't shake. He turned away from the window and faced the radio, the old device that had been the source of so much fear, so much madness. He had destroyed it, or so he thought. But it looked untouched, as if the numbers themselves had willed it back into existence. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but there was no time left to dwell on it. The final moment was here. 11:58 p.m. The clock struck, and in that instant the radio crackled to life. The sound was deafening in the stillness of the attic, the static hissing like a serpent coiled to strike. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he stared at the radio, waiting, knowing what was to come. The numbers began, the same sequence that had haunted him from the beginning. 4, 7, 3, 9. But this time there was something different. Beneath the numbers he heard something else, a voice, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It was his voice, distorted and twisted, echoing back at him from the depths of the broadcast. Alex Bennett. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but it carried with it a weight that Alex could feel in his very soul. It was the voice of inevitability, of fate, and it spoke with the authority of something that could not be denied. You were always meant to be here. Tears welled in Alex's eyes, blurring his vision as the voice continued, the numbers still playing in the background, relentless, unyielding. There is no escape. Alex fell to his knees, the weight of the broadcast pressing down on him like a physical force. He had known this moment was coming, had felt its pull since the very first broadcast, but nothing could have prepared him for the crushing reality of it. The numbers, the voice, they were all part of a design, a plan that he could never have understood, never have changed. 11:59 p.m. The clock ticked its final seconds, the sound echoing through the attic like a death knell. Alex's hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the radio. It felt alive under his touch, a conduit for the force that had taken control of his life, his fate. He wanted to pull away, to break free, but he couldn't. The numbers held him, bound him, and in that moment, he realized the truth. This was always how it was meant to end. As the clock struck midnight, the radio went silent. The numbers stopped, the voice vanished, and for the first time in weeks there was nothing but stillness. Alex knelt there, his hands resting on the radio, his breath coming in slow, measured gasps. The storm that had raged inside him was gone, replaced by a calm that was almost eerie in its completeness. He stood slowly and walked back to the window. The night was as peaceful as ever, the town below unaware of the battle that had just been fought and lost in the attic above. Alex stared out at the stars, their light cold and distant, and felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The numbers had fulfilled their purpose, and now there was nothing left for him here. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Alex turned away from the window. He walked to the door of the attic, opened it, and stepped into the darkness beyond. The house was silent, the air still, but there was no fear left in him, no dread of what was to come. He had faced his fate, and now he was free. The door closed behind him, the sound barely a whisper in the quiet of the morning. And in the attic, the radio, now silent, stood as the only witness to the final chapter of Alex Bennett's life. A life that had been written in numbers, dictated by a force beyond comprehension. And as the sun rose, its light filling the room, the radio crackled to life one final time. The numbers played once more, faint and distant, before fading into the static, and then silence. The story was over, but the numbers remained, waiting, always waiting, for their next victim.